I hadn't wanted to go to Applebee's, but my friends insisted. I'm not opposed to going out for a meal, but I hate going to Applebee's in our town. It's a gathering place for every half-drunk Chad and happy-hour drunk who doesn't have enough money to drink at the yacht club, but has too much class to go to the Tilted Stool. We aren't big drinkers. I mean, we like to tie on a few sometimes, but these guys get downright sloppy. We get a booth as far from the bar as we can, and it's still so damn noisy in there. By the end of the night, we're all yelling at each other just to be heard over the jukebox or the drunks. I spend the rest of the night with my eardrums pounding and my head ready to crack open. At least that's how it's always been until tonight. So, we're in the bag booth, like always, when I see the guy. Mark was talking about some girl he was seeing from work, Frank laughing like a donkey. His latest drink bounced around, threatening to spill as he pounded the table, and I looked up from my cowboy burger, just in time to see this guy hunkered over his food at the end of the row. He was bent over his plate, top of his bald head gleaming, and the light overhead lit him like a wax sculpture. I'm not usually one for people watching, but this guy kind of stood out. He reminded me of a story from Temple, back when I still went with my parents. They told us a story about a guy who'd built a creature to get revenge, a golem, and that was my first thought when I saw this guy. That sounds a little harsh, but I only mean he appeared not like a man, more like the approximation of a man. He had a white button-up, a red tie hanging loose around his neck, and even from here I could see the sweat starting to pool under his arms. Despite the noise, I could hear him almost perfectly, too. At first, I thought he was eating his meal real loudly, bent over at the waist like a dog. But the longer I watched, the more I thought he might be crying. His shoulders were hitching in slow up and down jerks, and he appeared to be sobbing into his plate. I felt a little voyeuristic as I watched him. Poor guy was probably living what was the worst day of his life. He'd probably been stood up for a date or lost his mom, and here I was just watching. When Mark nearly leaned into my ear, I jumped a little when he spoke. "What you looking at, Pally?" He followed my line of sight and found the poor guy before I could. Whew! That's a guy who's got a date with a rope later. Frank turned to look, but winced as Mark kicked him. "Don't look! Ain't you got no sense?" Poor fella. Kinda looks like this guy that came into the gas station the other night. He comes in high as a kite, and when I wouldn't sell him beer, he just starts crying, and Mark went on, but I wasn't really paying any attention anymore. I felt a little bad for continuing to watch him, but I just couldn't turn away. Something about him was mesmerizing. It was like driving past a car crash and being unable to stop staring at the bodies on the pavement. You know it's wrong to stare, but you just can't stop. Frank was braying laughter again, and I could see our waitress contemplating whether to cut him off or not as she came to get our plates. Mark told her he was fine, and Frank ordered another beer. And after several tense seconds and an elbow from Mark, I snapped back to myself and said I was okay too. "Geez, buddy," Mark said as the waitress shuffled off. "You gonna go over and propose?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, biting into my burger and realizing it was about lukewarm. Had I really been staring at that poor guy as my burger turned to ice? "You've been staring at him for like 10 minutes. Thought you were going to order him a drink for a minute." We all laughed, mine being a little forced, and then Mark stood up and waved to a pair coming through the door. Jim and his wife Celine waved at us in turn, and Frank moved our side of the table so the two lovebirds could sit together. They'd been inseparable since college, and I don't think I'd ever seen one without the other more than a handful of times. They excused their lateness, their sitter had been late, and Jim started in on a story about how she had gotten lost and turned down the wrong road, when I turned my attention back to the poor guy 2 booths down. He was still bent over his burger, still quietly sobbing, but the way his shoulders moved had started to seem wrong. I was no expert on sobbing, but this guy's herky-jerky movements were starting to look like something else. A rational part of me chastised myself for continuing to stare at this poor guy, but it was like a moth to flame now. He was my car wreck, and I was starting to notice signs of foul play. When he snorted loudly, I heard the laughter for the first time. It made me shiver a little as I heard it thrum into me like a badly played piano note. The guy wasn't crying. He was laughing. The more I looked, the more I could see bits of meat and lettuce sprayed over the tabletop. The longer I looked, the more I wondered how I'd misunderstood his laughter for crying. I was now drawn deeper into this web of strangeness. No escape in sight. Crying was one thing. I could understand crying, but who sits in a booth by themselves and laughs? Was he nuts? Some kind of mental case who was off his meds? Watching him from behind Selena's shoulder, I wondered if he might be dangerous. Maybe we should leave. Maybe I should suggest that we change venues, but all thought of escaping fled from me as he lifted his head from that plate. The scream that welled up inside me was cut off by my constricted throat and likely sounded like nothing so much as a sigh. The man's face looked like a fantastic bit of prosthesis. It was like a piece of Halloween decoration that's just a little too realistic. The kind you worry might contain a person who wants to bite. His face looked like the front of a thumb, calloused and rippled with wrinkles or ridges. His eyes were like colorless slits, something slashed into his face with a knife. His nose appeared to be drawn on, like a cartoon character's. He was unreal, something that shouldn't exist in polite society outside of a circus tent. His mouth, though, his mouth was the worst. His mouth was full of long, needle-like teeth, reminding me of an anglerfish as it protruded from his thin lips. Those teeth looked like they would never close comfortably. From here, it looked like they would constantly poke at your lips and gums, and you would be in agony most of the time. There were pieces of meat on those teeth, red raw chunks that had been speared by them, and that's when I looked down at the plate. It was covered in the grisly remains of what looked like chunks of raw hamburger meat. I doubted like hell that the staff had just handed this guy raw beef, but the alternative seemed even wilder. The alternative was that this man had brought his own raw meat from home so he could just consume it here in public. As the horror ran through me like ice water, I looked up to see those colorless slits observing me. The two of us just stared at each other for a count of 5. Then he pulled those thin lips and monstrous teeth into a smile, and I could see red pooling at the edges of his flesh. I glanced over at Mark and Frank, both now sitting on my side of the booth, but neither of them had noticed him. The 4 of them were involved in a conversation like there wasn't a monster sitting 12 feet from us. It seemed impossible that anyone could be having a normal conversation so close to that creature. Its very presence should have triggered some ancient primal node deep in our brains and forced us to either destroy it or flee from it. The 4 of them were talking about jobs and school and Jim and Celine's daughter, while this thing got to exist in humanity with the rest of us. It was too much to handle. Suddenly I wanted out. I wanted to be anywhere but there. I tried to tap on Mark to get him to move or to look up or just acknowledge that I was losing my mind within easy reach of him. But my body wouldn't respond. I managed to flick my fingers at his arm, bumping him a little, but He only rubbed a hand over it as if a bug had landed on him. Celine was talking about the new Pokemon game, and Mark and Frank were just nerdy enough and broke enough to be enraptured by her descriptions. I was stuck in a state of eye contact with that thing, and the longer I looked, the more it seemed to drink me in with those strange eyes. Then, without warning, it began to sink down in its seat, becoming lost beneath its table. I panicked. Suddenly not being able to see it was worse than having it on display. Could it sink beneath our table? How far could it go? How close could it get? I was suddenly imagining the damage those teeth could do to a foot, even a foot within a shoe, and I pulled mine up a little higher as Selena's words washed over me. He didn't resurface for quite some time, and you would have said that such a thing would not have gone unnoticed. Then he slid back up from under the table on the opposite side of the booth. He was grinning from ghastly ear to ear, and he looked like a little kid who's trying to play with the table behind them. There was still a table between us and him, but I was no longer sure how much protection that provided us. I didn't know his mental state, and whether he meant to do us harm or not, but when he dipped back down again, I started shaking. "What's wrong with you?" Mark asked suddenly, turning to look at me as I shuddered beside him. I pointed to the empty plate where the man had been sitting, and Mark looked over before scoffing loudly. "Oh no, your boyfriend left. Don't worry, I'm sure most of those guys at the bar will take you home if you ask them nicely enough." "What's going on?" Jim asked, noticing my discomfort and looking alarmed. "He's obsessed with the guy that's sitting a couple of tables back. Couldn't take his eyes off of him, I swear. Thought he was gonna try to console the guy for a minute. Dude was just sitting there crying, and this freak's over here looking at..." The bald, sweaty head began to surface behind Selena, and when I shouted for her to look out, the whole restaurant went dead silent. Jim and Selena turned to look, but there was nothing behind them. I'd had enough, though. I pushed Mark and Frank out of the way, freeing myself from the booth as I went to go check under the table behind us. He'd be crouching down there, grinning like the little goblin that he was. But as I got down on my knees and looked beneath, I was greeted by nothing but an empty space. The waitress asked me what I was looking for as I moved to look under his table as well, but by then I was already intent on leaving. I got in my car, threw the keys in the ignition, and sped off as fast as I could. Sitting at home now, I can't get that image out of my head. My phone's been blowing up, and I know my friends are worried. I can't make sense of it. What was that thing? Why did it take such an interest in me? Is it dangerous? Did it follow me home? Every time I close my eyes, I see those repulsive needle-like teeth and the no-color slits looking back at me. Every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to see anything. Every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to see anything but that creature again. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're thinking you might like to become one of my patrons, follow the link below to my Patreon. And as always, however you support the show, I appreciate it. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.